Hello, I'm Clive Johnson, coming today from Leigh-on-Sea in the UK. Welcome to Impact, a podcast about how we can each bring about real change in the world and getting practical in making that happen.
And hello, I'm Ellen Bince, coming today from Wheaton, Illinois in the USA. A special welcome if you're listening for the first time, and a big thank you to our new subscribers. Each week, we look at one aspect of how we can connect our hearts to offer healing for others with our collective intention, prayers, and meditation, and go behind the headlines of a critical happening in our world that needs our attention right now.
In today's episode, we take one of these regular deep dives to more fully understand and tune in with something many of us may know only a little about, and see where we might home in with our prayers and intentions. And as we record, it's 20th of August, 2025. You're just back from one of your many trips, aren't you?
Yes, from Kansas City, Missouri.
Wonderful.
Had a wonderful trip. I did a training for contemplative labyrinth activism there, and it was great, well received. Hopefully that work will ripple out and spread.
Wonderful.
Mhm.
Yeah, great work.
Happy to be home, though.
It's often nice coming home, isn't it?
It is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
As you doubtless know, there's been a lot of activity in Alaska and Washington over the past week, a lot more traveling going on with world leaders, actually. As President Trump has hosted both the Russian and Ukrainian presidents in separate meetings, and the latter also being attended by a hastily assembled group of European leaders, as well as NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte and the European Union President Ursula von der Leyen. Ostensibly, the aim has been to broker a way forward to ending the 3.5-year conflict between Russia and Ukraine. A bilateral meeting involving Presidents Putin and Zelensky initially, and then later President Trump, is now on the cards, although not yet confirmed. If the prospect for achieving the peace that all sides claim they seek is at the moment hard to judge. We know that any peace negotiation can often be messy. They typically involve compromise. In some cases, this may mean leaders going back on promises they previously made. What arises from negotiations may have implications for the future prospects for peace. If an invader of another country gets away with seizing territory, for example, that may incentivize other would-be territory grabbers in future. Delicate diplomacy is needed, face-saving, and also having agreements that politicians can sell to their own people matter a great deal. In the case of the Russia-Ukraine dispute, the stakes are very high, as we know. All of Europe, which is currently ill-prepared to defend itself against Russia, without the help of NATO and especially the United States, has been put on alert to the potential threat of an expansionist Russia. For the first time in decades, many Western nations are worried. And I think that's why we saw such a rush to want to be in the White House on Monday of the week we're recording. Throughout the war, we've considered different aspects of what's happening on the ground. We dedicated episodes to the profound effects for Ukrainian people as well as for Russians. We've continued to hold the weary soldiers and those being called up against their will in our intentions and prayers. We've given attention to the politicians and the geopolitics.
However, now that serious negotiations may well be happening soon, we thought it would be helpful to take stock of what each side sees as its rights, especially when it comes to territory. Western media often focuses, rightly we believe, on the need for the West to support Ukraine in its defense against an army that invaded its territory without provocation. Sympathies have naturally aligned with Ukraine. However, leaving aside the obvious wrong of an invasion, when it comes to territorial claims, many of us may be ignorant of the history through which Russia views things. It's a messy picture, as we'll see. But we feel it's important to understand this aspect of what is likely motivating Putin, if it may be just one aspect. So being as objective as we can, not taking sides for this podcast at least, we thought it's time for a deep dive. As always, we'll come back to see where our intentions and prayers may be needed, especially given that the prospect of negotiations that could end this deadly conflict is now stronger than ever.
It's still very, very hard to see how that might be achieved, given how far apart the sides are, but at least they're talking, potentially. So how did the land that forms the modern state of Ukraine come to be? The land forming modern Ukraine has a complex and multi-layered history that's marked by migration, conquest, and an evolving statehood that spanned thousands of years. The region was once home to Iranian-speaking groups, as well as being a Greek and Roman colony. Ancient trade routes connected local tribes to broader empires, particularly the Mongolian Empire, with Ukraine being strategically important for its bordering of the Black Sea and also giving access between Europe and Asia. However, it's in the Middle Ages that Slavic tribes first settled the area, and this is when we see the formation of Kievan Rus, the area that now contains Ukraine's capital, Kyiv. Ukraine's first entry into written history appears in the 9th century, with Kyiv being a central cultural and political hub. Kievan Rus is now considered by most Ukrainians as the precursor to Ukrainian statehood. I think there's a little bit before the history which is worth mentioning here, and that is the name Rus was given to the Vikings from Sweden, particularly, and Scandinavia, who settled in this area. So a lot of the original Russian people in this region trace their origins to the Vikings who actually invaded.
Wow.
Yeah. So that was a little aside that I didn't know until I looked into this yesterday, in fact.
As a nation, Ukraine's current northern neighbor, Russia, traditionally traces its origins to the establishment of the Rus state in 862. 862, that's a long time ago. This first East Slavic state was founded and led by the Varangian ruler Oleg of Novgorod. Having Kyiv as its capital after 882, uniting the northern and southern lands of the Eastern Slavs under one authority. Following the decline of Kievan Rus due to Mongol invasions in the 13th century, Moscow rose as a key political center. Moscow eventually gained independence from Mongol rule in 1480, forming the Grand Duchy of Moscow, which later evolved in the Tsardom of Russia, as Ivan the Terrible was crowned as its first Tsar in 1547. Russia subsequently expanded and modernized during the early 18th century under Peter the Great, becoming the Russian Empire. By the 14th century, most Ukrainian lands had come under the control of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, Kingdom of Poland, and later the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. In the 17th century, the Cossack Hetmanate, or domain, briefly established a semi-autonomous Ukrainian constitution. The Pereyaslav Agreement, I hope I said that right, led to a protectorate relationship with Russia. But over time, Ukraine was partitioned between Russia and Poland, and the Hetmanate's autonomy was abolished. There's a lot there.
Yeah.
That's a lot.
Yeah. And it's interesting this time, Russia, before Peter the Great, was actually really quite small in territory in terms of where we look at the map today. Quite something to appreciate the extent of the Mongolian Empire as well. Virtually extending way out to the Baltic. Really incredible at that time. When old empires collapsed following World War I and after the Russian Revolution in 1917, various Ukrainian states attempted to form independent governments and unify Ukrainian territory, but they faced foreign intervention and internal upheaval. After a brief period of independence, most of Ukraine was incorporated into the Soviet Union as the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. Interestingly, they were mainly the eastern regions of Ukraine where, post the fall of the USSR, there was still a lot of Russians living. I think around about 20% of the whole population of Ukraine at that time identified itself as Russian. And it was some of the western regions of Ukraine that only joined the USSR following World War II. In the modern era, Ukraine declared independence in 1991. This was when the Soviet Union collapsed. And at that time, it was formed by the borders that had existed until Russia's invasion of Crimea back in March 2014. So in short, successive waves of migration, conquest by neighboring states, and wars have led to a patchwork of historical influences and shifting borders. However, Ukraine's notion of statehood is rooted in the era of Kievan Rus, its medieval principalities, Cossack autonomy, and 20th century independence movements. Kievan Rus is especially considered the precursor to modern Ukrainian statehood, as we said. Its heartland included regions that today make up modern Ukraine, cementing a geographical foundation for Ukrainian identity. Some historians, such as Mikhailo Hiroshevsky, again, I hope I've said that right, say that it was at this stage in history that the traditions, political institutions, and cultural practices that provided a base for the future Ukrainian state developed. Kievan Rus introduced the region's first written legal code, that was the Ruskaya Pravda, established Orthodox Christianity, and fostered a distinct East Slavic culture with international connections through trade and diplomacy. And even after the Mongol invasion and the fragmentation of Kievan Rus, the idea of a separate Ukrainian identity persisted, especially through successor states like the Kingdom of Galicia-Volhynia, which continued elements of Kievan Rus statehood and culture. Today, Ukrainians emphasize Kievan Rus as the cradle of their national identity and the start of an unbroken state tradition. However, given the history, the distinct histories claimed by both Russia and Belarus also trace their origins back to Kievan Rus. It was the capital. Kiev was essentially the capital of what became Russia, you see, and a very important religious center as well for the Orthodox Church.
So therein lies the rub, right? Everyone considers that the cradle of their history.
Exactly.
Yeah. This was so good for me to read because it does help understand a little bit more the fight for this land.
Yes.
So what was the demarcation of Ukrainian territory following the breakup of the former Soviet Union, which is what we grew up knowing, the USSR, right?
Very much so, yes.
Right. The demarcation of Ukrainian territory following the breakup of the former Soviet Union in 1991 led to enduring disagreements between Ukraine and Russia. While Ukraine's independence and borders were initially recognized by Russia, the process of border demarcation and delineation remained contentious. Russia delayed fully settling border agreements and used various diplomatic, economic, and security tactics to influence Ukraine's sovereignty. The strongest territorial disagreements centered on Crimea and the regions of Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhzhia, and Kherson. Russia annexed Crimea in 2014, claiming historical ties and local support, a move widely seen by Ukraine and the international community as being illegal. Armed conflict erupted in eastern Ukraine, with Russia subsequently claiming their annexation as well. Ukraine insists on its borders as established at the time of Soviet dissolution, which was 1991, right?
Yeah.
Citing international law, the principle of territorial integrity, and multiple agreements that recognized Ukraine's sovereignty and borders, including the 1991 Belovetsa Accords and the 1993 Commonwealth Charter. Russia, however, has tried to challenge the legitimacy of these borders, both politically and through force.
It's interesting. I mean, these areas, these eastern areas, as we know, again, and particularly Crimea, were where many people living identified as Russians. So this is the other, apart from the Kievan Rus, this is the other big area of contention. And as we've said, this is pretty much how the annexation of Crimea was being justified by Russia.
I remember, I don't know if listeners remember that I have a connection to the Ukraine. My late husband's family was from the Ukraine and so my in-laws and everything. I remember in 2014 them talking about this in the area that they were fighting over. They would say, it's Russian.
Mm,
People there speak Russian. They really weren't that worried about it, the
no,
people from
no,
there.
no, no.
It was interesting to me because in the West, we were appalled. And their attitude was like, it's already Russian. Everyone there's Russian.
Yeah, and I think
So
it's
to your
an
point,
important reason for me why we're doing this episode. One of the important reasons is there's a lot of misconception and a lot of lack of knowledge, really.
just history. There's
It's
just
just
history to
history.
it.
But I was listening to a radio phone-in show. It was a broadcaster, journalist I usually have high regard for. It's usually pretty balanced. But as is the way in the West, we side with Ukraine 100%. And anything and everything that comes out of the Kremlin is to be condemned. Indeed, most things coming out of the White House get that treatment in the UK as well.
Sorry about that.
But, there was one or two things that this journalist was saying, which were repeated by, again, seemingly esteemed journalists in the UK media, that were just plain wrong. Absolutely plain wrong, factually. So I think it's important we do, as best we can, get a handle on the history. It's not as straightforward as people make out. Sorry I interrupted there, didn't I?
That's okay. That's okay. No, because it leads into the two nations have also disagreed over maritime borders.
Yep.
Particularly in the Azov Sea and Kerch Strait, resulting in crises such as Russia's construction of the Tuzla Dam and competing claims to internal waters. So despite various treaties, the physical demarcation of the Russia-Ukraine border has been incomplete, with Russia frequently pushing for open or transparent borders and using its energy, trade, and military leverage to influence outcomes.
We're not covering this in this podcast, but it's probably worth mentioning that parts of Ukraine that Russia seeks control over, particularly, are very mineral rich. A lot of very valuable minerals in that area.
Which is usually the case, right?
It is indeed. And we know there's also the security issue as well, whether Ukraine should join NATO or not. So we're not sort of getting into some of the more broader areas beyond the history. But just the history on its own is complex enough, I think. So what then is the basis of Russia's claim to territory that came to be part of Ukraine following the 1991 breakup of the USSR? Vladimir Putin and Russian officials argue that much of Ukraine, as we said before, especially in the east and south, are historic Russian lands that were lost due to upheavals in the 20th century. This includes invoking concepts like Nova Rossiya, New Russia, an imperial administrative region from the late 18th century, and claims that Soviet authorities arbitrarily assigned primordially Russian territories to Soviet Ukraine. As we've mentioned, Russian narratives often also assert that Kievan Rus, this medieval state centered around present-day Kiev, constitutes the origin of both Russian and Ukrainian peoples. This is used to argue that Ukraine and Russia share a historical unity, dismissing Ukrainian statehood as an anti-Russia project created by external actors. Putin has repeatedly claimed that the boundaries of the Soviet Ukraine, formalized between 1919 and 1924, were arbitrarily drawn up by Bolshevik leaders without regard for ethnicity or historical affiliation. He argues these borders incorporated territory, particularly in the south and east, as we mentioned, Donbass, the Black Sea coast and Crimea, that had never belonged to Ukraine, but were detached from Russia due to Soviet policies. Russia cited these historical and identity-based narratives to justify the 2014 annexation of Crimea, as well as the more recent formal annexation of Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, and Zaporizhzhia. Russian official rhetoric often claims that these regions have always had strong Russian ties, and that their transfer to Ukraine was nonsense and unfair.
Mhm. Historians overwhelmingly dispute Russia's claim to territory that became part of Ukraine after the collapse of the USSR, challenging the historical, cultural, and legal arguments presented by it. They generally agree that Kievan Rus was a medieval state whose legacy contributed to the formation of three distinct nations: Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia. Its cultural and political centers were located primarily in what is now Ukraine. Historians emphasize that it is misleading for Russia to claim sole succession or exclusive rights to this legacy. In fact, the principal successor states after Kievan Rus included the Principality of Galicia, Volhynia in present-day Ukraine, and the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, both of which went their separate ways from Moscow after the 13th and 14th centuries. The assertion that all of Kievan Rus lands are inherently Russian is viewed as a narrative invented by Russian imperial and Soviet writing of history, and not one that's grounded in historical reality. Historians note that counter to Russian claims, Ukrainian language and identity began forming well before the 16th century, and that for centuries, Ukraine and Russia evolved separately, linguistically, culturally, and politically. The borders of Soviet Union formalized before the independence were acknowledged by Russia and other neighboring states in the early 1990s through multiple treaties and international agreements. Russian government narratives frequently appropriate or erase Ukrainian history, portraying Ukrainian cities, figures, and achievements as, quote, Russian. Historians call these tactics imperialist, designed to justify territorial claims and aggression, and liken them to historical examples of expansionist propaganda. In short, historians reject Russia's territorial claims as a blend of myth-making, selective reading of history, and political convenience, citing clear evidence of Ukraine's distinct and legitimate development as a nation and the legality of its post-1991 borders. And isn't that interesting?
So whose history are we to believe? Yeah. What then are the likely territorial demands that Russia may make in any negotiation with Ukraine to end the current war? Russia's territorial demands are likely to focus on regions it currently occupies or claims, including taking full control of the Donetsk and Luhansk oblasts in eastern Ukraine, control of a frozen front line in Kherson and Zaporizhzhia, and recognition as Crimea as Russian territory. Putin has indicated some willingness to negotiate regarding Sumy and Kharkiv oblasts, although the details remain unclear. Russia is also demanding security guarantees perceived as limiting Ukraine's sovereignty and military capabilities, as we mentioned earlier, framing these as addressing the root causes of the war, though these conditions are seen as non-negotiable from Russia's side. And it does seem that Russia is very concerned if, for example, Ukraine was to join NATO. Ukrainian President Zelensky has indicated that territorial questions will be discussed directly between himself and Putin, emphasizing Ukraine's reluctance to cede land, but acknowledging the need for negotiations. It's unlikely Ukraine will agree to cede large-scale areas of land, but several reports and analyses suggest possible scenarios where Ukraine might consider limited concessions, such as possibly ceding control of a portion of the Donbas region. There's also been talk of a so-called land swap, where Russia might return some small territories in areas like Sumy and Kharkiv oblasts, where Ukraine has made military advances, potentially in exchange for concessions in Donbas. Ukraine may also be willing to discuss security guarantees involving third-party oversight or restrictions on military activities as part of a broader peace framework. This remains, as we can see, a very complex and contested area. However, Ukraine has consistently rejected any concessions involving Crimea, viewing it as an integral part of Ukraine's sovereign territory. Writing on Truth Media earlier this week, apparently. I'm not a great subscriber, I'm not a subscriber myself, but I did see this one, whatever it is, tweet or whatever you call it. President Trump has said that they must give up on this claim.
Ukraine's constitution prohibits renouncing territory without a nationwide referendum, making unilateral concessions legally difficult. Any territorial discussion would likely require broad domestic support and legal steps. Any negotiations will then be complex and contentious, with Russia continuing military offensives while engaging in talks, reflecting its reluctance to agree to a full ceasefire.
And I guess both Putin and Zelensky, and we might look to that other great area of conflict, which is much in the Western media at the moment, Netanyahu, they're all concerned about their own future, or potentially Zelensky seemingly losing support domestically. So if you go back with an agreement that gives away a lot of your territory, that is not going to go down very well with most of your people, I wouldn't think.
No, I think that step of, having to let the whole population agree is a little difficult.
Yep,
Yeah.
definitely. So where might we hone in with our intention and prayers? And this is the point where you may wish to bookmark this point in the podcast, come back to if you wish. We're just going to mention in fairly quick succession a number of areas you might want to hold intention. So you may want to pause a little while after each of these to hold in your intention and prayers. But taking a moment just to allow yourself to really become present, feeling into your connection with the physical ground, being open to welcoming guidance, insight, and to offering intention. We will that all involved in any negotiation for peace between Ukraine and Russia will be moved to consider the perspectives of the historical sovereignty of disputed territories taken by their opponents.
We will that journalists will be moved to report on the historical basis of the dispute without prejudice for either side's writing of history, and to accurately report any outstanding points of difference emerging from the talks, including where our intentions and prayers may be needed.
We will that all attending any mediation will be moved by compassion for the children who have been separated from their parents in the war, to seek their repatriation and to be quickly reunited with their families.
We ask that all international mediators participating in any talks between Ukraine and Russia, and specifically the United States, will be ready to fully listen to and be sensitive to the justification for territorial claims made by both sides.
We will that the attending leaders of the warring sides, President Zelensky and Putin, will be moved by a readiness to accept compromise or concession where this is in the interest of the highest good for the security and well-being of both their own people and for those residing or fighting across the border.
We will that those facilitating the talks will be wise in mediating the alternative historical claims of Ukraine and Russia on Kievan Rus.
And this week, as the prospect for negotiating a peace deal between Russia and Ukraine edges closer, we suggest holding as our main intention: we will for wisdom for the facilitators of any forthcoming peace talks involving Russia and Ukraine, to be sensitive to the personalities and motivations of those present, while steering a course that may allow open and respectful discussion. Please join us in holding this.
So that about wraps it up for this episode. Remember, you can connect with us in the Facebook group and for live intention holding in Clive's Daily Insight Timer offerings, and with me in the Labyrinth Activist Network Zoom calls. Details of how to hook up with these are in our show notes. Look out too for our next special topic episode, which we'll be releasing in the next few days. Thank you for listening and for sharing with us and holding intentions. We look forward to connecting again next time. And in the meantime,
thank you, go well, stay safe.
And remember, we're more powerful together.
Impact is presented by Ellen Bintz and Clive Johnson and produced by Impact Productions. Our theme music is by Chris Collins and our logo artwork is by Auto Classic. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts and please leave us a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Audible or your favourite podcast provider. We're a non-commercial podcast dedicated to people of any faith tradition or none who yearn for healing in our troubled world. Please pass on the word so others may join us in making an impact. Thank you for listening.